Hello everyone, so I'm here today to do my wrap-up for January 2023, the first wrap-up of the year. And this year I have switched up things a little bit. Apart from the books I read in January, I also want to talk a bit about the stats of the books I've read. So I have been very good about tracking my reading story graph, and I can share those stats with you. So first of all, I've read 8 books and 3,175 pages, which is roughly about 100 pages a day, which I'm happy with. And I've read mostly reflective, informative, emotional, and adventurous. Reflective is something that is always a big chunk of my reading, but I'm interested that adventures is also a big chunk this time. It's normally not that much, so yeah, that was interesting. About the pace, most of the books I've read, 57% were slow, and 43 were categorized as medium. I haven't read any fast-paced books this month, and again, that's kind of representative of my reading. I normally do read some fast books throughout the year, but it's not a lot. Most of my reading is slow and medium. When we look at the page number, so 50% of the books were less than 300 pages, which is interesting, and 13% were more than 500 pages. I found this interesting because I always have the feeling that most of the books I read are around 300-400 pages, so it was interesting to see that that was not the case. Then when we look at the division between fiction and non-fiction, non-fiction was exactly 25% and fiction was 75%, which is again very representative of my reading, so I was not surprised about that. And then when we look at the genres, literary and historical are the main chunk. And then there is some nature, short stories, which was not really short stories, but we will get into that. Science, history, fantasy, and contemporary. And I think that's more or less not surprising. Literary and historical are always my most read genres. I don't normally read short stories or fantasy, but occasionally I do, and it seems that this month was one of the ones that I did. The next one I'm really happy about. So 50% of the books that I read were print and 50% were digital. And if you have seen my goals for this year, you will know that most of the books that I read last year were digital in the last couple of years, and I want to shift that back to print, and this is a step in the right direction. The fact that 50% of it was print, I'm very happy about. Another thing that is also not as normal for me is that I read in English, Spanish and Dutch. So I read 2 books in Spanish, 1 in Dutch and 5 in English. I normally read mostly just English, but this time it happened to be a little bit more spread, and I think that's also partly because I read more print books, and my library has books in Dutch, obviously. So I think that's why, but yeah, that was an interesting thing as well. And finally, the pages read in January, the spread is not surprising to me. As I said, if you divide the number of pages by the number of days in January, it's roughly 100 pages, but obviously I tend to read a little bit less during the week and a little bit more during the weekends, and then there are some outliers, like for example at the beginning of the month my bike was broken, so I was commuting to work by public transport, which made me read more. And at the end of the month, my parents were visiting, so that's why my page count is a lot lower at the end of the month. And then there is a couple of outliers because of some of the books I read. So, for example, there is a very big peak at the beginning of the month, and that's because I read this book, which, yes, it is 188 pages, but most of it is just pictures. So yeah, it theoretically counts. And there is another peak in the middle of the month that also represents me reading a very big non-fiction book that had like 100 pages of bibliography. So when I marked that book as finished, it added those 100 pages to that day, which I actually didn't read the bibliography. So yeah, that's a little bit of of the representation of that data, but yeah, I think there were no big surprises, but there are some slight changes that I'm happy with. So with that said, I think we can start talking about the books. The first book that I finished was The Monk Who Spoke Snakish by Andrus Kivirähk. And this I read for the Read Around the World project for Estonia, and I talk more about it in my Read Around the World project video, which I will link. But yeah, basically this book is a fantasy book about it's set sort of in the Middle Ages, I suppose, in Estonia, and there are this tension between a community that lives in the forest and a community of people that decide to move into the village and believe in God and eat processed foods and do agricultural work and stuff. And the main protagonist lives in the forest, and his uncle teaches him to speak Snakish, which is basically he can speak the language of snakes, and snakes are considered to be the kings of the forest. And so if he speaks Snakish, not only can he speak to snakes, but also he will speak to other animals, and the other animals will obey him because snakes are the kings and they tell them what to do. And it was a very interesting book. I think in terms of the folklore, it's not something I've seen before, and also in terms of the pace was quite slow at the beginning, and I was just enjoying the fact that we got to know this way of life of the different types of people. At the second half of the book, the pace changes, and I didn't like that part as much, but I think that the first part was very interesting, and it was something different, especially for all these Read Around the World projects books that I'm reading. They tend to be very political and very social, and this was something different, and I enjoyed it for that as well. Then the next book that I finished was Flights by Olga Tokarczuk, and this has been in my TBR for a while, so I really wanted to read this one. Also, Lorraine bought this one for me. It's a present from her, so I was very happy to finally get to it, and I really liked it. So this one is categorized as short stories. I don't think it's quite that. It is sort of like there is a woman that starts telling part of her life story, and she's kind of a vagabond, and so this is like a collection of the people she meets and the ideas she meets on the way. It's very reflective, and it's very it doesn't have a plot, it doesn't have it does have sort of a thread on how a movement of people in terms of physically, in terms of through time, death, that kind of thing. There is also like music, it's about airports and things like that, so it's about all kinds of movement, and I really enjoyed it. I have a full review of it, so I will link that down below if you're interested in more details, but I can just say that I really enjoyed this. I think it was Olga Tokarczuk is amazing, so yes. Then the next book I finished was The Hidden Life of Trees by Peter Wohlleben, and this is quite a famous book, but this is an abridged version, and it does have a lot of pictures in it, like they're beautiful, like that, and well, a lot of tree pictures that are very beautiful, and this was very calming to read on a Sunday. Just sit and read, and I really enjoyed it, but I also think that the writing of it, like the actual text, he basically talks about how forests are the trees are very interconnected, and they create an actual community in which some trees take care of others, and that's why trees are healthier when they are in a forest and when they are by themselves. And it also does talk about how the trees in cities develop differently because of that. So that was interesting, but I also have to say that there was also a lot of comparisons of trees to people, and I found that a little bit too iffy, the way he talked about that, and a little bit naive at times, how how he talks about these things, it just felt very unscientific for such a work. I would have liked to see something a little bit more science-based. Not that this is not true, but it didn't have like the feeling of the data and the objectivity that more scientific works have. This is more of a very heartfelt interpretation of the data, if that makes sense. And that's why I didn't find this so impactful, but still I found the experience of reading it very calming and very relaxing, and especially with the photos and stuff. So I'm not saying that this is a bad book or I regret reading it. I'm just saying that I was expecting something a little bit different. The next book I read was Soviet Milk by Nora Ikstena, and this is also for the Read Around the World project for Lithuania. And this is a mother-daughter relationship kind of book. It changes perspective between a mother and a daughter, and there are a lot of parallels in their lives. So at the beginning they don't tell you when they are changing perspective, and it almost feels like it's the same person, and it takes a little bit of time to realize that they're talking about two different people. And it is it does talk a lot about the background of the Soviet Union and how that affected these two people, and how differently they took the things that happened to them. So in both cases there is a case of the parent, the father, the actual father, biological father, not being present, and it is hinted that it's because of the Soviet regime. And in the first case, in the mother's case, she has a stepfather, and he seems to be very caring, and she has very warm feelings for him, but at the same time she still has that bitter feeling about her father not being there and what happened to her mom because of it as well, and to herself. And in the other case, in the daughter's case, she also does not have a father, but she doesn't seem to care. Like, she takes it more like that's how it is and that's it. There is also a lot of talk about mental health and trauma. The mother suffers a lot with mental health issues, and that's something that is also very, I think, well addressed in the book. And overall, I found it a very compulsive read. I wanted to be immersed, very immersive. I wanted to be immersed in the life of these two people and know what happened next to them. And even though there is not a big plot, it still had that wanting to know more kind of thing, and I think it was very well done. Then the next book I read was Madres y Camioneros by Ivana Dobrakovová, and this, even though it's not tagged, so it is kind of short stories, but they are long short stories, so I think that the book has 5 in total, so it has about 50 pages per story. And it's more or less about how women are controlled and oppressed by the patriarchy, basically, in very different ways. And sometimes it's not men that do that to them, but sometimes they are, and sometimes it's just society and the expectations of having a husband and all of that. There is also one story about a teenager that gets trapped into these online chats in which older men want to have sex with her, and like theoretically they say they want to be her partner, but she knows it's not true, but she still is trapped into that addiction of attention and stuff like that. I found the writing was nothing special in either way, nothing especially good or bad, but the stories and the topics were explored in a very simple way, in a way which is like I didn't think they were very innovative, or they were saying something that I haven't heard a million times before. So in my opinion, and maybe it's because of the things I've read before and the experiences I've had before, it was nothing particularly special. It was not bad, but just not special to me. but yeah, it was okay. Then the next book I read was Revolusi by David van Reybrouck, and this is a book in Dutch, and I read it because it was part of the favorite books that Lorraine read in 2022, and I was reading all of her favorite books. And this is a big history of Indonesia, basically. And I found it, so the beginning and the end, I think, have more of a personal view of the author, and I enjoyed those parts more. In the middle is more factual about different people that invaded Indonesia. Indonesia has been invaded by many people, by like the British, the Dutch, the Japanese, the Americans. It has had a lot of history on that, and at some point they said that has to stop, and they became independent, and that's kind of the history of all of that. And yeah, as I said, I think it's a very complete work, and it's also, even though the author, I think, I'm not sure if it's Dutch or Belgian, but he does address the fact that he is not Indonesian, and he says that, well, even though I'm not Indonesian, Indonesia is one of the biggest countries in the world, and so we should all be interested in Indonesia and Indonesian culture and Indonesian history, and that's why this book exists. And I thought that was very poignant, because it's true, like, we all know things about the US and the UK and even India, and most people don't know anything about Indonesia, even though it's part of that list of big countries. So this was very informative. With that said, I think that I didn't get all that I could have gotten from it, just because it was in Dutch, and my Dutch, it's not my strongest language, so it was a bit of a struggle for me to get through it, just because of the language barrier. But that doesn't mean that I didn't understand what it was saying. It just took longer for me to get it. So yes, and I think this is not translated to English. As far as I know, it's only translated to German, so if you speak German, you can still read this. Then the next book I finished was El Pentateuco de Isaac, or Isaac's Torah, by Wagenstein, and this I read for the Read Around the World project for Bulgaria. Unfortunately, it had nothing to do with Bulgaria, even though the author is Bulgarian. It was about a man that was born in a region of Eastern Europe that was first part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then it became Poland, and then became the USSR, and then I think it became Poland again, and he went through all of those, the First World War, the Second World War, and he just wants a simple life, but because of him being Jew in that region of the world at that time of the world, he was just thrown into all of these wars, and then a concentration camps, and then the Gulag in the USSR, and it's just a really difficult life, and it's almost told like a joke, because sometimes it just sounds like a joke that he had to go through all of these things. It just doesn't make sense. But yeah, it was okay. I think it was entertaining to read, but it was not adding anything particularly valuable to the conversation. I think yeah, if you want to know about those topics, probably this is not the best book, but it was still interesting, and it was kind of funny to hear about how all those borders changed so many times, and all of the ideas of the leaders changed so many times, and how that affected to the everyday people. That was interesting. And then the last book that I read this month is Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi, and this was again part of the favorite books of Lorraine. And yeah, this one was it had some really good things going for it, but there were also some things that just didn't work for me. So this is following Gifty, who is an African American of Ghanaian descent. Like her mother and her father are Ghanaian, and she's like first generation or second generation immigrant from Ghana. And it has several topics. So she grew up Christian, and she now is a scientist, and she's struggling with that relationship between science and Christianity or faith. And then there is another factor, a big factor in her life, that is that her brother died because of addiction that was caused by oxytocin, and she now is a scientist doing her PhD on addiction. And she makes clear several times that she didn't choose that path because of her brother, but most people seem to assume that. But still, there is a lot of discussion about how addiction happens and whose fault is it, or it's just a disease, that kind of thing. And then there's of course parts about racism, because she's black, and that's always a thing in the US. So yeah, those are all more or less the main topics that it explores, and it's amazing that it can explore that in such a small book. But I didn't think that all of them were equally successful. I really enjoyed the discussion about addiction. I think that went a lot deeper and more philosophical, but I think that, for example, the discussions about religion were just very surface level. So yeah, some of the things worked for me and some of them didn't. But yeah, I understand why many people like this book. It's just maybe it was not 100% for me. So yeah, those are all the books that I read this month. Let me know if you have read any of them, if you have thoughts on any of them, and also on the stats. Let me know if you found them interesting and if you want me to keep doing them. And until next video, bye!